Morning, Greg, good iawn I ddechrau, yeah? Okay, good morning, welcome. I'm not going to talk for long because I know you want to get on to Walter. I'll do about an hour and a half introduction to Walter Murch, and then he's going to do a 10-minute presentation at the end. If that's fine with everybody? Excellent. Just a few things. We're going to show some DVDs. There's going to be a bit of delay from him being introduced to actually play it because the man in the back's got to repatch cables and stuff through technical things. So anyway, Walter, I'll just hand over to you, sir. You all know who he is. I don't need to tell you much about him. So, anyway, Walter Murch.
Thank you. Is the mic working? Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. There's an old adage about who gets final cut on film, and their response is the projectionist has final cut. And I was thinking of that last night when we were watching Apocalypse. Not so much, well, in terms of the picture also, because every projection is, in a sense, a new performance, particularly regarding the sound. The image, more or less, you have to get an even light on the screen. You have to get at least 16 foot-lamberts of light on the screen. And then if the image is agreed upon, then it should just take care of itself. Sound is more problematical because for Apocalypse Now, there are 6 sources of sound, and every acoustic space is slightly different. And the equipment, the speakers are slightly different. And so there's an anticipation when I sit down and watch the film, what's it going to be like this time in this environment? And I would just point out 2 things about the screening last night. For some reason, and I don't know what it is, the DCP that they were running, the middle section of the film was out of sync by 2 or 3 frames. Now, is that a big thing? Well, yes, if you think how much work we did trying to get it in sync in the first place. And the other question is, why was the middle section out of sync? The beginning was good and the end was good, but there was about a 30-minute section in the middle where the sound was 2, maybe 3 frames ahead of the picture. It's psychologically more disturbing to see that than it is a delay, because the nature of sound is that it's always out of sync. You in the back of the room are listening to me probably 1 frame out of sync. Basically 40 feet is a single frame. So maybe we're 80 feet away, that's 2 frames. And that's life. Sound is delayed to picture or image because light travels 1,000,000 times faster than sound does. But we have never experienced sound in the natural world. We never experienced the sound ahead of the image, except in film. So if you have an image and the sound is 2 frames behind the picture, we kind of roll with that. That's okay. I mean, you would want it to be in sync, but if it's a little delayed, our mind is programmed to deal with sound with a slight delay through millions of years of evolution. But sound happening before the image is psychologically a little disturbing. Anyway, that's a mystery that I don't know the answer to. It's something to do with how the DCP was made, that particular one. And the acoustic space yesterday was very good, but it was its own thing. I would say sitting there that the surrounds were too loud. They were too aggressive by 3 decibels, something. And the center speaker was good, but the left and the right, the wing speakers, were probably 2 decibels down from where they were. What is a decibel? A single decibel is what we can appreciate as change. If you play a sound and then you play a sound 1 decibel louder than that, on average, human beings will say, I hear it slightly louder. So 2 decibels is, you know, if 1 decibel is, 2 decibels is, and it makes a difference, but it's not obviously the catastrophe. 6 decibels, which is 50% louder, would, or less, is significant. Anyway, that's just a report from the interior of my mind as I was watching the film last night. When I was working on Apocalypse Redux, I'm going to try to open this, but I can't. Yeah, there we go. In 2000, so 17 years ago, a package came in the mail to me, addressed from the US government. And your heart always sort of skips a beat when that happens. How complicated is my life going to get now? And I opened it up, and it surprisingly was a videotape. This is back in Precambrian times of videotapes. It was a videotape and a little audio cassette, a very primitive technology, even for the year 2000. And a letter that said, hello, my name is Patrick Lockney. I'm from the National Archives, and we wonder if you could help us. And what transpired was a piece of film shot by Thomas Edison in 1894. The soundtrack for that film had been discovered. So we're talking really early in the evolution of film. Film itself, the first experiments by Edison were in 1889, so this is a few years later, and they were already trying to marry sound and film. It was an experiment. Edison's lab in New Jersey was a research and development department, kind of the first of those things. And they had set up a man playing a violin and had recorded on a cylinder the sound of the violin. Now that cylinder, wherever it was, had been lost for many years, but Patrick Lockney had, he thought, uncovered what it might be. It was in the back of Edison's lab in deep, deep, deep storage, and it was broken, but it had an identifying mark on it. What we were looking, I have a nice clicker here. This is the setup, and you may have seen this. This clip of film gets run frequently as an example of the first gay cinema, because these 2 guys on the right are dancing. Not the case. This is back in 1894 when men danced with each other all the time. But that's William Dixon, who was playing the violin. He is arguably the person that did invent what we know as 35 millimeter motion pictures. He was working at Edison's lab at the time. And somewhere off screen was a little rotating cylinder, and that big thing was the microphone. So this is what Patrick had discovered: violin by W.K.L. Dixon with kineto, meaning kinetograph, which is what they called cinema in the Edison's lab. And that's what it looked like when you saw it. It was clearly broken. So Patrick had it fixed. This is a piece of art restoration, and they transcribed the sound on it, but it was very confusing sound. There was lots of stops and starts, and somebody was playing the violin, but they had no way to marry the 2 things up. So they thought of me, and they said, can you do this? Well, I was right in the middle of working on Apocalypse Redux and up to here with the film that I was working on, but I wrote them back and said, I'll try. You know, my schedule is unpredictable. So every day I would come in, I would see this package on the shelf and feel guilty about not getting to it, and then I would plunge into what I was editing on Apocalypse. Finally, after 3 or 4 weeks of this, the guilt overcame my resistance and said, okay, we'll attack it. And this is what we did, and this is what you do today if you are trying to establish sync between two pieces of media. The sound cylinder itself was 3 minutes long, and we thought, historical evidence, that it was recorded at 120 RPM, pretty fast. The image was 17 seconds long. We thought it was recorded at 40 frames a second. That's what we thought Edison did. So 2 different pieces of media, 2 different time bases, no agreed upon start. Big challenge. So what we did was we digitized both. We took them off the VHS and put them into the Avid, which is what I was working on. And then we time crunched the image. When I looked at it as it was first transcribed, telecinied, people looked in slow motion. So we made a guess. 24 is what percent of 40? Crunch it by that amount. Does it look normal? Yeah, I think it's pretty normal. All right, let's go with that. And then try to find 2 sync points just by trial and error. My dad played the violin, so I had some memory of what this meant. And so I would just listen to all 3 minutes trying to find where there was something. Like, does that work? No. Does that work? No. What about that? Yeah, that's possible. Now let's find the end. Is that correct? All right, maybe. Now expand the sound to match between those 2 points. Does it work? And after about pecking away at this for about 3 hours, it finally was in sync. And the hair on the back of my neck stood up, because not only was this the first time anyone had heard this and seen this in 110 years, but it was the first time anybody had ever seen it in sync. The reason this experiment didn't work is that this is the first time human beings ever confronted the problem of synchronization. Life is in sync, so you think naively, well, we'll just do it. But then you realize, no, it's more complicated than that. If there are 2 different systems, then both have to have an agreed upon time base, and you have to have an agreed upon start mark. That's the meaning of the clapstick, and that's the meaning of the sprockets on the film back in film days. Now we have electronic equivalents of those, but back then they didn't have that, and so this is an experiment that they just kicked to one side and said, well, we'll deal with that later. And here is the film. And what the click you hear is the broken cylinder. That's every time it went around, it went tick, tick, tick. So here it is. We removed the click. So the year that this was done, a baby was born in Galveston, Texas. He was the son or grandson of Hungarian immigrants, and his name was King Vidor. Vidor is a Hungarian name. I don't know why they called him King, but he was King Vidor. And he came and talked to us, film students, in 1967 at the age of 73, which is the age I am now. King Vidor was one of the main drivers of cinema in the United States in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and he was still making films in the 50s and 60s. In fact, he has the longest resume of any filmmaker ever. His first film he shot in 1913 at the age of 19. It was a documentary he made about, I think, the Galveston flood or something to do with that. And he made a documentary about something called The Metaphor, about artistic creation in 1980. So at the age of, and he was then 86 years old. So before you here today is the entire history of cinema. So that film, the beginning of sound and image, King Vidor, born, making films, The Parade, all these great silent films, came to talk to us at the age of 73, and I was 22. And now I am 73, talking to you. Some of you are 22. And that's it. So within the space of 2 human lifetimes, the entire history of cinema is in parenthesis. And that's a remarkable thing for how, let's say, advanced this language is, because that's what cinema is. We have invented a new language. Arguably, human beings are who they are through language. That's what gave us, by some peculiar attribute that we are still struggling to come to terms with, the Homo sapiens people figured out how to deal with abstract concepts through sound, through language, and eventually writing it down and eventually printing it and everything else. With cinema, we have a new language, and it's new. It's, as I said, it's barely 2 human lifetimes old. And we're still struggling. We are struggling trying to figure out what it is, and who knows where it will go. It's exciting to think, but it's very early in its development. And you are coming along as the 3rd human lifetime to do what and you will make lots of discoveries, and it will transform stuff. It, as a language, is always transforming from one dialect to another, and dialects then split off and become their own languages. It's a very exciting prospect to think about. So this was about 100 years ago, 1915, and from what you just saw, that primitive little scratchy thing, to this, which is a problematical film. It celebrates the fiery cross of the Ku Klux Klan. And, but it was arguably the beginning of what we call feature motion pictures. There had been motion pictures before, but they were of the short variety, kind of like what we see on YouTube today. This kicked it into another realm where it would be instantly recognizable to all of us. People came, in the dark, they sat in the dark for an hour and a half, 2 hours. There were different lengths of this film, and they were moved and transported. President Wilson at the time saw this film and described it as writing with lightning, that this was a script written in lightning. And he was getting at that new language. This is a new language of some kind. But here we are, not quite today, so that's 100 years. And right in the middle of that is me going to film school. And that's me and Aggie, I was talking about last night, the day we got married in New York. And we motorcycled zigzag across the United States, 6,000 miles, zigging and zagging, and arrived at film school. This is me a few years later editing Apocalypse Now. That gives you some idea of the 7 tons of material. I was trying to find a frame that had gotten lost at the bottom of a trim bin. And you can see the racks of film behind me with the numbers on them. Each one of those things lasted about 10 minutes. So multiply that by the 235 hours of film. You can imagine how many of those boxes there were. This is all, as I was saying yesterday, the clipper ships era of filmmaking. This is Return to Oz. This is Kerry Kohler, assistant editor. And at a bench, he is, for the camera, recreating the moment of what we called first blood, which was the first time anyone on the crew cut themselves deeply enough to let blood flow, because we were surrounded with dangerous objects, whirring wheels that could somehow, the metal could spring open and zing you across the hand, splicing blocks, rotating sink machines that had teeth on them, everything moving very fast. So he's going, ow, as he cuts himself on the splicer. There's Les Hodgson, the editor, on the Moviola that we used back then, this sewing machine on legs that not only showed you the film, but destroyed the film as you were showing it. You tried to minimize the destruction, but it was being destroyed as you edited, physically. And this is me editing First Night, also in London. That's the chem in the background. This is the standing chem. You see the plywood boxes that are there. Does this have a little, yeah, there it is. That was so that I could stand to edit. And there's lots to say about that. We can talk about it in the question time. And these are all the rolls of film for one scene that I was editing. These are the pictures, the frame grabs from the scene. Victor Fleming, a slightly younger version of King Vidor, observed in 1939, he directed 2 films that he directed came out, Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz. And he observed that about editing, that good editing makes the film look well directed. Fair enough. Great editing makes the film look like it wasn't directed at all, which is a slightly paradoxical thing for him to say when you think he was a great director himself. But what he was trying to get the films to be was to be things that happened that didn't look like they were constructed artificially. And that is his take on it. I share that to a large extent. There are things to say about that. There are other ways of approaching film. As we said, film is a language, and there are many different kinds of languages. One language is this, that the direction of a film, the goal of the direction of a film is to make the director disappear, and even the editor to disappear, and everyone making it to simply disappear, and the audience simply fuses with the film as if it was a dream that they were having themselves with no outside action. And you can make a little algebraic equation that motion pictures, which are pictures that move, plus montage, which is a better word than editing. Editing is the word we use in English for various historical reasons, but the Romance languages, Polish, use the word montage, which is more accurate because montage means to put together, to mount something. If a plumber putting pipes together is doing montage in France. You would ask the plumber, montage the pipes. And on a very almost literal sense, that's what we do. We take these pipes of film and screw them together in the way that makes the fluid of the story and the emotion run in the most interesting, transparent, and leak-free way possible. We never completely succeed, but that's our goal. You may have eaten this fellow, as beautiful as he or she is. You may have eaten last night, for all I know. It's a shrimp that is very widespread in the world. The ancient world knew and valued the Mantis shrimp. There are some very peculiar things about him or her, which we'll get to in a second. But just to prime the pump here, think about this shrimp. Very dangerous creature, by the way. In Australia, it's known as the thumb cutter shrimp because its claw has the quickest reaction time of any animal that we know. It releases itself so violently that it has the force of a .22 bullet. And if your flesh gets in the way of this thing, what happens to your hand is the same thing that happens if it gets shot with a .22 bullet. It's so quick that the bubbles that it leaves in its wake are sonoluminescent. And you can look that up on Google. There are many words in English and in every language for the act of looking. We have many ways of looking. We can glance, we can glimpse, we can gawk, gaze, goggle, gander, look, ogle, da, 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 and that list could probably be 3 times as long. And we know what each of these things mean. I don't like the way he looked at me. What does that mean? Well, there was something in the ogle or the gawk that made us upset. We don't have any words for sound like this. We just have hear and listen, which are verbs. But there's no noun that says, I listened to that sound in a certain way. Why is that? It's got something to do with the way we are, the way our brains are constructed, the fact that 1/3 of our brain is dedicated to processing visual information, and several orders of magnitude less of our brain is dedicated to sound. As a thought experiment, imagine human beings had evolved sort of like lemurs. If you ever see a picture of a lemur, they're primates that live in Madagascar. If our eyes looked like C-3PO's eyes, just fixed discs, so that if I wanted to look at you, I would have to do that. So C-3PO's eyes, which are like lemur's eyes, and ears like the people in Avatar. So ears like a dog or a cat. So you can tell by the position of the ears of a cat what the emotions of the cat are, what they're listening to and how they're listening to it. So a cat would have many words, if it had language, it would have many words for different ways of listening. And we know that we listen in many, many different ways. The sound of a little scratching noise at the door, is that my wife coming home, or is that somebody trying to break into the house? In both cases, I listen very differently to that sound, and I have very different emotions for it. But we have no words to describe this. It's a peculiarity, and it gets at something that is part of the glory of sound and how its relationship to image, and also some of its practical difficulties. So that's what the sound that we hear is black, and these are cycles per second, so vibrations, 200 cycles per second. A, if you play A on the piano, it's 440 vibrations. The string is vibrating 440 times a second. So our hearing stops around 25 cycles, and it also stops up around 20,000 cycles, depending on how old you are and how much rock and roll music you listen to. So those are vibrations per second, but that's 10 octaves of sound, from 25 to 25,000, 10 doublings of frequency, which is a lot. Not all animals have that. Reptiles, snakes, have very limited bandwidth of how they hear the world. Bats and dolphins hear much more than we do. It's just one of the peculiarities of evolution. Here's another spectrum, which is the electromagnetic spectrum. This is light, and on the left, it's vibrations per second. On the right, it's trillions of vibrations per second. So, huge difference. But we can hear 10 octaves of sound, but we can only see 1 octave of light. All of this is light. It's just light at wavelengths that we cannot see. 1 octave. Beyond that is ultraviolet light and X-ray light. I mean, we call the electromagnetic vibration that we can see, we call it light. But, you know, in that sense, X-rays are a form of light. It's just light we cannot see with our eyes. Below is infrared and down to heat. Radio waves are somewhere in there. So, big difference, 10 and 1. So you would think that we would be more sound-oriented than we are, but we're not. And that's part of this conundrum of sound, is what's going on here? Let me go back. I need to... All right. So what you're going to hear is Beethoven, Ninth Symphony, with the 10 octaves, slightly less actually in this room, and I'm going to reduce the symphony to 1 octave of sound, and then back to 10 octaves. So imagine that we heard, that we saw the world. We see the world the way it sounds when it's compressed. Imagine what it would be like to be able to see the world in full 10 octaves of visible light. Could we see X-rays, and could we see heat? Well, being human beings, very inventive creatures that we are, we've developed machines that do allow us to see X-rays and to see heat, and to listen to radio waves and watch television and everything. So we've artificially expanded, but as biological creatures, we are limited to this 1 octave. That's what we see. So back to our shrimp. This is one of the creatures who can see into the ultraviolet and into the infrared. We have, our eyes have, we are trichromatic creatures. We have 3 different cones in our eyes that allow us to see blue, green, in red. This guy has 16 color receptors. Why? Why does a shrimp have this amazing ability? We don't know the answer, but this shrimp holds the record for being able to perceive huge variations in color. That's why the shrimp is so beautiful. The shrimp is beautiful to us. The shrimps to each other must be unbelievably beautiful because they can see these infinite gradations in color that we simply can't see. By the way, women are sometimes four-chromatic. Women occasionally, because of the XY chromosome something, have the ability to see into areas of color that men cannot ever see. What you're listening to is the sound of that the baby hears in the womb all the time, 24 hours a day. Heartbeat, breathing, and stomach gurgling. This is what you heard 4.5 months after the conception. And you heard it for another 4.5 months, and it never stopped. And it was added to by your mother's voice, your father's voice, the music that they listened to. It's a machine. You're in a machine. And the average level of this, as you hear it in the womb, is 75 decibels. And then you're born, and suddenly, for the first time ever, you hear something you've never heard before, which is that. And it must be kind of frightening, because if that happens in the womb, it means mom is dead. So a baby alone at night in a dark room, asleep, wakes up, where's the sound? And then mom suddenly appears, or dad, and picks the baby up. It's okay, it's all right, don't go back to him. The baby goes back to sleep. You tiptoe out of the room, close the door. Unfortunately, it goes click. The baby wakes up. But the import of silence is tremendous on us because our consciousness evolved in the presence of sound. We now know, because we've done motion picture sonograms of babies in the womb, they're fully conscious, active creatures. Sometimes twins fight with each other and suck their thumb and they listen. We can play sounds from outside the womb and they kind of do that. They react to it. So what's true is that sound environment is present at conception. The baby is developing, and at a certain point, consciousness kicks in, but it kicks in the presence of sound. Sound is present at the birth of consciousness. That line in the Bible, in the beginning was the Word, well, change word to sound. In the beginning was sound. And it goes some distance, I think, to explain the strange pull that music has on us. We created music. What are we doing? Why do we respond to music the way we do? It's partly because when music really gets to us, it's taking us back to some place really early in our existence that is very moving to us. And we as filmmakers use silence in a creative, it's one of the arrows in our quiver is where can we use silence for emotional effect? sometimes in very unanticipated places. We'll get to that in a second. I'll show you an example of that. The other thing that the child learns is causality, synchronization, like Edison's test. In the womb, there is just you, meaning the baby, and nothing else. You don't know that there is a separate person called mom yet. You don't know about dad or the world. You don't see anything. You don't taste anything. You don't smell anything. You don't really feel anything. Kind of slippery stuff. But you hear with great precision. But what does it all mean? What is that dunk sound? Dunk, dunk. I keep dunk. What is dunk? What is that? Well, you get born and you discover that dad chops wood and dunk, dunk. Oh, that's what that is. So you begin to piece together through synchronization a sound that you heard in the womb with what you see. Obviously, the biggest one of those is mother's voice. You're right next to the mother's voice, and you hear that, and now you're born and you see a face. We're programmed to recognize and concentrate on faces, and you see this thing moving. What is that? Well, it's the lips, and we hear that sound that we heard, and we begin to understand, oh, that's mom? What is that? And related to that is space. In the womb, there is no space. We're just there. And you don't know anything else. It's dark. But when you're born, you now begin to pick up the difference between mom close, breastfeeding you, and mom on the other side of the room. You're on bed and you see mother coming through the door and you go, and she speaks to you, but the voice sounds different over there than it sounds when she's here. And so you begin to understand that I can't touch mom when her voice sounds like that. But when her voice sounds like this, I can touch her and I am being fed by milk from mom. And both causality and space are things that we in film use creatively all the time. Causality is just, what do we sync up? And creatively, we can make creative decisions about what we sync up with what we see. Ideally, we find places where the synchronization is provocative, and I'll show an example of that in a minute, and not really obvious. Why am I hearing that sound looking at what I'm looking at? What meaning is there in that? And we want to get you, we filmmakers want to get you to, we want to provoke you into reaction because we're presenting you with a riddle. Why is this happening? And you either think about it consciously or you think about it subconsciously, but you're thinking about it and reacting to it, sometimes in ways that you're not even conscious of. And then space, we use space, and again, contradictions in space. We can, if we show a close-up of somebody and we hear their voice as if it's coming from very far away, that has an emotional effect. And we're doing that on purpose to make you feel something about this person or the situation. And the flip side, we see somebody far away and we hear their voice as if it's right here, and everything in between. So these are what used to be, in America, used to be called $10 words, ontogenic and phylogenic. But the part of the conundrum of sound is that it is ontogenically old, meaning in your experience, it is the oldest of the senses. It's the first one to be turned on. First of all, senses 4.5 months after conception. But it is phylogenetically young. So us as a species, the ability to hear with the precision and detail that we hear with is relatively late. As I said earlier, reptiles cannot hear with the detail and precision that we can hear. Amphibians, even less so. Fish, maybe even less so. So mammals have pretty good, we have the best hearing, as far as we know, of all creatures on Earth. We primates are not as good as some other ones. Whales, for instance, can hear many more octaves than we can. But what that means is that by the time we expanded hearing to be significant in terms of the vibrations, the brain had already been colonized by vision. So a third of the brain had already been spoken for, and then we said, oh, but we want sound to be more detailed. Sorry, there's no room. You know, how can we have to compensate for that somehow. And that's, again, part of this conundrum of sound, is that we can hear 10 octaves, but we can't do very much, relatively speaking, with it. Whereas in vision, we see only 1 octave, but we do an unbelievable amount with it, because we have this Cray supercomputer in our head that is taking a relatively limited bandwidth and doing a lot with it, extracting a lot of meaning out of it. I don't, can we turn that light off for just a sec, or these lights? Can we turn these off? Yeah. If you look at this, and the longer you look at it, the more you will see it. The blue seems to be behind the red. How many of you can see that? So, yeah, okay. That's generally what we see. And if you flip it, now the red looks a little ahead of the blue. But these are two-dimensional images. Why are we seeing this mysterious effect? There it is again, another way of seeing it. And we can interpolate an object. Well, we can turn the lights back up. This has another one of those $10 words. It's called Chromo Stereopsis, which means stereo vision because of color. And the reason it happens is based partly on this Newtonian observation that light going through a prism spreads out because of the different frequency. As we saw earlier, blue light vibrates quicker than red light does, and the quicker the vibration, the more the light is deflected in the going through, in this case, glass. So red is deflected less than blue. Here are our 2 eyes, and there's an object, and when that object appears in front of us, our eyes tilt in. If you look at the eyes, they're going to tilt in. Now they're looking, converging at the object. And this is so that the object hits the back of the eye at what's called the fovea, which is where we attend to things. Whenever you look at anything, that's what's happening. If something's further away and we're still looking at A, here's what happens. That object B shows up at a different point on the retina than the object that we're looking at. That's why if I'm holding my finger in front of my face, I'm looking at my finger and I see two lights over there. One this side, one that side. If I look at the light, contradictorily, now I see two fingers, one here, one there. But that's what's happening. So this relates to Chromo Stereopsis because if A is red, it goes right to the fovea. And if B is blue, blue gets bent more than A does, and it winds up on either side of the fovea, on the retina, and we see two of them. And we struggle, our brain struggles with this, trying to make, why am I seeing two? Oh, I get it, it's because it's further away than the red thing. So the brain helps you, the lower orders of the brain, before you become conscious of it, your brain helps you come to terms with this conundrum, this paradox. Why is it the way it is? The brain doesn't know, this lower level doesn't know about Newtonian refraction. It just says, I'm being presented with a paradox. The red object is here, the blue object is to the left of it in the left eye and the right of it in the right eye. Why is that? Oh, it must be because the blue object is further back than the red. And so the brain helps you to see the world, but it's making a mistake in doing that. And you have to sort of deal with the consequences of that. That's the refraction. If B were actually further away, yeah, it's just, but news presenters always have a purple background, deep blue background, because of this effect. You want the news presenter to be forward of the background, to have more dimensionality, so people who produce news on television always, always have blue in the background to the news presenter. In fact, if you ever see the opposite, it's sort of disorienting. And not only news presenters knew this. If you do a search for news presenters, that's what you see. But medieval stained glass artists knew it too. Blue, by the way, was, in those days, you got it from a stone called lapis lazuli, which came from Afghanistan and was unbelievably expensive. But they were willing to pay the money to get this effect. So saints, warm-toned creatures, were always presented, or where you could afford it, were presented against a blue background to give them this standout quality. All right, so how does this relate to film? It gets at this dilemma, which is also something to take advantage of, which is if we can present to the audience something that is inherently contradictory but resolvable, they will create a dimensionality through their own brain power that doesn't really exist. And one of the ways that a sound designer and editor can collaborate is by taking advantage of this. What I'd like to show you now is a section from Godfather 1. I use this as an example not because it's particularly clear, but because almost everyone has seen The Godfather, and it's an easy thing to kind of get traction with. The scene I'm going to show you is the killing of Sollozzo in the film. This is Michael Corleone being sent precisely because he is the innocent one of the four brothers to negotiate with Sollozzo, who attempted to kill his father, Michael's father, and the corrupt chief of police, McCluskey. They would not have met with any of the other three brothers, but with Michael they will meet because he is known to be innocent. Secretly, the family has hidden a gun in the bathroom of the restaurant so that when Michael is searched, he's clean, but when he goes into the bathroom, maybe he can find a gun, and then he comes back out and kills them. The decision, this happens pretty much at the middle of the film, and Francis and Nino Rota, the composer, had decided to, the original plan was to have an intermission after this scene. There's something to say about that. But anyway, there was a big music cue written for this intermission after the murders happened. To not undercut that music, Francis and Nino decided to have no background music during this scene, which is even more interesting when you realize half of the scene is in Italian without any subtitles, which even today would be a risky thing to do. In 1972, even more so. Unless you speak Italian, you don't know what these people are saying. So you have to look carefully at their body language, which was our intention in making the film, is to kind of destabilize you a little bit as the audience and make you pay attention to how people said things, not so much what they were saying. Nonetheless, Francis and I thought, well, the scene is a long scene and it needs something. Another filmmaker would have some tense music here, but we're not going to do that. What can we do? I grew up in New York, not far from where this restaurant was, and I knew that in that part of the Bronx, the underground system in New York came above ground. So it was the overground in the Bronx, and the systems were made on steel stilts, and the whole thing made a very loud noise, the train and the vibration of the framing. So maybe we can imagine that in this restaurant, it's close to the overground, and the train will go by, a train will go by and then disappear, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one. And each time the sound will get louder until the final one, when Michael is making the decision to actually kill these people, it not only is a rumbling sound, but we added the screech of the wheels against the metal, a kind of psycho sound. And that's very much, this sound is functioning as a string section of an orchestra would function. At first it's the low cello, and then gradually more higher strings enter, and then finally it's these really on the top of the violin stuff, but it's all explainable because it's just the overground subway system. The twist here dramatically is that when the gun was given to Michael by Clemenza, he was being shown it, Clemenza said, "Come out of the bathroom and come out blasting. Just come out and start shooting." And Michael doesn't do that. He comes out and sits down. And if you in the audience remember what Clemenza said, you think, well, what's he going to do? Is he going to kill them or not? And the Italian comes back, Sollozzo speaking in Italian, and there's a slow move in on Michael, and his eyes are doing this kind of thing where he's thinking, and the sound is getting louder and louder, screechier and screechier, and then suddenly he stands up, pulls out the gun, bang, and at the instant of the bang, the screeching sound stops, which is what you would have done with music. In other words, at that point, we reveal the artificiality of what we have done. The real subway would have not cut off like that. So bang, nothing. And now there's what we talked about earlier, there's silence, relative silence, but silence. And then now what's going to happen, and Michael drops the gun like he was told to do, exits the room, and then the big music comes in. So let's run that clip.
Italian food in this restaurant.
Good. Try the veal. It's the best in the city.
I'll have it.
Capito?
Turn it up just a little.
I'm gonna speak Italian to Mike.
Go ahead.
Mi dispiace.
Ci sei.
Tu hai sapere che che è successo tra me e tuo padre fu una cosa di business. E io ho un grosso rispetto per tuo padre, ma tuo padre pensa all'antica. E tu non lo vuoi capire che io sono un uomo di onore.
Come delle sti cosi. Disagio.
Lo sai? Che tu vuoi sapere che io ho aiutato la famiglia d'Italia. Io credo che ci dobbiamo mettere in accordo. Io voglio pace. E lasciamo perdere che tutti sti cazzati.
Ma vuoi giocare?
Che?
Come si dice? What I want, what's most important to me, is that I have a guarantee. No more attempts on my father's life.
What guarantees can I give you, Mike? I'm the hunted one. I missed my chance. You think too much of me, kid. I'm not that clever. All I want is a truce.
I have to go to the bathroom. Is that all right?
You're gonna go, you're gonna go. I frisked him. He's clean.
Don't take too long.
I'm afraid the towel's young punk.
Senti me? Mica tu mi capisci, no? Sei italiano come tuo padre? Tuo padre sta male. Bandito sta meglio. Il cambio ti fa un ognuno. E mettiamo tutto a posto. Steve sta lì. Si deve finire.
So in a sense, there's a sort of Chromo Stereopsis going on there, in that what you're hearing has nothing to do with what you're looking at. In fact, this was not in the script. It was not anything that was planned during shooting. But you're looking at two people having a talk, a discussion, with a third person, sort of third wheel, McCluskey, and then a shooting happens. And we never established that there are these overground trains in that neighborhood. We just put them there and leave it to you as the audience to sort of figure that out. And the miracle that is partly due to the conundrum that we were talking about before, Chromo Stereopsis, is that if a sound makes you feel a certain way, because of the way our brains are structured, you take that feeling and you project it out into the visual that you're looking at, and you ascribe that emotion to something that you're seeing rather than something that you're hearing. So many times people have said that that sound makes them think that this is the sound of Michael's neurons sort of rubbing against each other, trying to make the decision of should I kill them or not. There was an amusing, in quotes, amusing interview after Mario Puzo died with Sammy Gravano, who was a hitman for the Mafia, who turned state's evidence and was given a different identity and allowed to live anonymously in Arizona or something. But he was a man who had contract killed 19 people. And the interviewer for the New York Times found him and talked to him about Mario Puzo, who had just died. And the question was Mario Puzo part of the Mafia? How did he know all of that stuff? Puzo himself said, no way, I'm a homebody, I live with my mother, I just went to the library and I did a lot of research. But the question was, is that true? And so that question was put to Gravano, and Gravano said, no way, he had to be part of the mob. He had to have an inside track. And the interviewer said, well, why? How do you know? And he said, well, all right, I'll give you a for instance, he said. You remember that scene where Michael kills Sollozzo and McCluskey? Yes. You remember the sound that you heard just before he killed them? Yes. That's the sound I heard in my head when I made my first hit. So inadvertently, this kid from Morningside Heights in New York, me, thinking about how to make a scene more effective, came up with a sound that convinced a Mafia hitman that Mario Puzo was in the Mafia, because that's the sound, in quotes, that he heard at the moment of killing his first person. So, he went on to kill another 18 people after that. Whether he heard the same sound after that, I don't know. Another way of interpreting this sound is that that Michael is screaming internally. His face is impassive, but there's a contradiction there, that not only is he going to kill somebody, but he's going to kill a dream, and he knows it. The dream that he expressed at the beginning of the film when he told his girlfriend, Kay, Diane Keaton, that, I'm the youngest son of this family, but I'm not part of this family. My destiny is elsewhere. That's not me, Kay, he says. I'm going to go somewhere else with my life. And what he's doing in the terms of protecting his family by killing these two people is taking his dream and killing it as well, strangling it, and the direction of his life at this moment turns a right angle to where it was going. And of course, by the end of the film, he winds up as the Godfather, replacing his father instead of one of the other three brothers, one of whom was killed, Sonny, in the film. So, in a sense, you can think of this sound as the articulation of an internal screaming that he is doing the moment before he pulls the trigger. The flip side of this, let's run the next clip from Godfather 3, is right after another shooting at the end of Godfather 3, Michael's daughter, Mary, is killed by accident. And there's an assassination attempt on Michael, which goes wrong, and Mary is killed, which for Michael is worse than if he had been killed. And the shooting happens. Mary dies on the steps of this opera house, and everyone is stunned, Michael most of all. And he sees that she's dead. He falls back on the stairs, and he screams. It's the scream, in a sense, that finally came out, the scream that he should have screamed with this scene. He finally screams at the end of Godfather, at the end of the trilogy. And I was working on the editing, the picture editing of Godfather 3 with two other editors, Barry Malkin and Lisa Fruchtman. And I was working on something in the middle of the film or the beginning of the film, I forget. And Lisa was working on the scene you're about to see. And we were all on the same floor of an office building, and we all had our doors open, and we could hear what everyone else was doing, and she was cutting this scene all day, and all day I was hearing Michael Corleone screaming. And at the end of the day, I was like, all right, stop screaming, which is not the right attitude to have, but that's the attitude I had. And then as the chess pieces got shuffled, I wound up editing the last 20 minutes of the film, and this scene included. And so here I was, and here's Michael screaming, and on a whim almost, maybe fueled by my annoyance several weeks earlier, I thought, what would happen if we just cut the scream out? So he is there sitting on the steps, and then he falls back, opens his mouth, and nothing comes out. Silence, another one of our things, which is another kind of Chromo Stereopsis. It's, wait a minute, I should be hearing a sound, but I'm not. What is this? And that's a little hot potato, but it's a resolvable hot potato that the filmmakers are throwing in the lap of the audience. It was triggered also by a suggestion that Francis, before I started editing this scene, Francis said, see if you can work in the reactions of the people around Michael. So he's there, he's devastated, and let's take a look. How is Kay reacting to this? How are the other actors? What do they think about Michael at this moment? And the thing about a scream is that it's horrible, but it's also a release of tension. That's when we're really hurt, physically, we scream because it's a way we have of releasing tension. Sometimes it doesn't work, we still are hurting, but screaming makes it feel less painful. It's just part of our inbuilt reaction. We share this with all other animals. So once you scream and tension is released, then something has to happen. And so what immediately didn't work as I was putting the scene together was Michael screaming and people watching. It's like that doesn't work. Because if somebody's screaming, you rush to that person. But on this whim, I went, what happens? Click. I just turned the film, I flipped the track. So it was silent. And now it's like, it's a conundrum. It's this Chromo Stereopsis again. What is this? And we are feeling it as an audience, but the other actors in the scene, the characters in the scene, are feeling it too. What's going to happen? Is he having a heart attack? Is he having a stroke? what is this? And so we see that mystery, and we see the other characters reacting to that mystery the way we are reacting. Like, what? What? And it's repeated, that cut to Michael with this empty scream, I think 3 times. I'll see it when we see it. And then finally on the 4th scream, 4th time we cut back to Michael, the scream comes out. And that's really what it was every time until I turned off the sound. And then, of course, once he screams, then people start moving and things happen and the film moves along to its conclusion. This is virtually the final scene in the movie. So let's take a look at the scene. At the same level that you did the other one.
Dad?
back to my slides here for a sec. I'll just leave you with this one thing, and then we'll do some Q&A. One of the things that surprised me greatly when I left film school, I mean, it was happening even in film school, but when I went out into the world and started to try to find what I would be doing, is that I would get involved in a project and dive into it, work like crazy, and then finish the project. And at the end of the project, there would be this period of, what is that? What happened? Because the fact is that you are very deep into the project, deeper than you realize you are, and then it gets more and more intense as you reach the deadline, and then suddenly it's over, and it's like you're projected off into space, and you're not really equipped to deal with normal life yet. And where's the film? What happened? And you're bereft. And there's a period of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or weeks where you gradually begin to get some sort of equilibrium back. And what I'd like you to look at here is a series of concentric circles. Just look at the circles as they move, and then see what happens when they stop and we're looking at something else. So just look fixedly at the center of these circles. It looks like the hands are sort of bulging outward, and then eventually it settles down, although I can still see a little residual. And I first encountered this phenomenon when I was 5 years old in New York, and my parents would take me to the Thanksgiving parade, the Macy's Day Parade in New York, and I would scoot through the crowd and find a place to sit right close to the parade, scrunched down, and for an hour I would watch the parade go by, these big balloons, helium balloons, and then the best part was when the last float had gone by, I would look down at the asphalt of Fifth Avenue, and the asphalt would seem to be oozing in the opposite direction that the parade was going. So if the parade was going left to right, the asphalt was oozing right to left. To the 5-year-old mind, that meant, well, it's oozing from somewhere, so I would look upstream, so to speak, and that would be oozing. And then I would look downstream, where is it going? And that would be oozing. And what's that? And then eventually, of course, like with this illusion, it would settle down, and I began to understand that this was not really happening. The asphalt wasn't moving. It was just something that was going on inside my head. And this has an official name. It's called the Waterfall Effect, because if you go to where there's a waterfall, and like we just did, you look at the waterfall, and for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, fixedly, and then shift your gaze quickly to the cliff face beside the waterfall, the stone will seem to be moving up in the opposite direction from what you have been seeing. So what we experience, especially in all films, and in fact, this is part of what is now called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the trouble that even Willard had in Apocalypse Now, that you're in this intense environment, and then you go home, which is not at war, and you're sitting there with your wife, and she says, we need some more cornflakes. Can you go down to the store? And you go down to the store, and there are 17 different kinds of cornflakes, and you decide which one to buy, and you come back to the house, and what? What happened? And because to bring it back to post-production, what an editor and sound editors are doing is taking material that's coming from, like that circle, from kind of outside. Okay, here are the new dailies, and you take it and make it coherent, because it comes to you in an incoherent form. The film is being shot out of sequence, pickup shots are being done, so whatever gets shot during any one day can be 6 different things, 6 different scenes. So you take these and you put them in their appropriate place, and then you are editing the scene, and you take these dailies, which are, I don't know, 5 hours of material, and you try to scrunch it down to a 4-minute scene. And so you're making things coherent. Every day, that's what's happening to you. You're taking incoherence and making it coherent. Incoherence, coherence. After a while, this becomes normal, because this is what you do every day. This little guy, that's us at the beginning of a project, and the top of this mountain is the end of the project, and in one part of your mind, you think, I'm climbing this mountain, and someday I will get to the top. So this is what you think is happening. You get close, and then the negative is cut or whatever, and you get to the top. And it's a flat top of the mountain. You're no longer humping up the slope. Well, that's true, but only part of the way. This accommodation principle means that anything you do for a long period of time becomes normalized. It becomes flat, because flat is normal. A good example of that are those prism glasses that you can do in psychology experiments that turn the world upside down. So you put on these glasses, and suddenly the ceiling is down there and the floor is up there, and I reach for the bottle, but I can't figure it out, because the bottle is facing down, and eventually I get it. But the human brain figures it out, and after a day or two, the world turns right side up again. Even though the glasses are flipping, you now see the world the right way, and it's all normal. And then another disaster comes when, after a week, you take the glasses off. Now, just looking at the world, it's upside down. And so you have to spend 2 days kind of feeling seasick until the world makes itself right again. So rather than a mountain, what part of you is feeling is this. Just, this is normal. And so you go along, and you reach the end, and after a day or two, you sort of settle on, and yet there's this contradiction. You know you're done, but the world seems to be falling apart, because like that circle, you've gotten used to stuff coming in and being coherent, coming in being coherent. The Macy's Day Parade, the Thanksgiving Parade, the Waterfall. No. Suddenly it's over, and now the reverse thing happens. So you look at the wall, you're sitting on the sofa staring at the wall, and in a certain sense, the wall is coming apart. Not literally in this sense, but it feels like the world is coming apart. And if you look at the evening news, you will have many reasons to think the world is falling apart. That's what news specializes in, is things falling apart. And so you have to protect yourself against this, because it's a transitory phase, and you're not really equipped to deal with big issues here. It's like a divorce or a death in the family. There's that aspect to it. Don't make any big decisions in this period because, like being seasick, it will pass. And it has very much a similarity to seasickness. That seasickness is caused also by this disconnect. We are on a boat, we're sitting here, and our eyes are seeing the dining room of the boat, but our ears, our eustachian tubes, are feeling this. But we're seeing this. So there's a disconnect. Whenever there's a profound disconnect like that, an alarm bell goes off in your brain that says, you have been poisoned. There's something in you that is wrong. Throw up, do something, scream, you know. And so that's why you throw up when you're seasick, is you're trying to get rid of a poison that isn't there. The illusion of a poison being created by the disconnect between what your eustachian tubes are telling you and what your eyes are seeing. So this little fellow, if you don't watch out, you can get into trouble and fall off the edge of the cliff. Thank you very much.